Construction of the pyramids. Ancient Egypt was one of the last civilizations where magical and non-magical people lived side by side in the open. Then a pharaoh pointed at the desert and demanded 3 stone monuments taller than anything ever built. 2 million blocks, each heavier than a car. Muggles couldn't do it alone, and they knew exactly who could. Wizards didn't enter the project as partners, they entered as labor. Levitating blocks that weighed more than houses, enchanting foundations to survive millennia, weaving protective curses so sophisticated that Bill Weasley, Gringotts' best curse breaker, was still dismantling them in the 1990s. Muggles designed the vision, Wizards made the physics corporate, and the history books somehow forgot to mention who did the heavy lifting. The result was so impossible looking that thousands of years later, Muggles would rather credit extraterrestrials than admit they once had help from people they now pretend are fictional. The pyramids are the last visible proof that the two worlds ever built something together. Everything after that, Wizards built in secret. The Oracle at Delphi. Muggles in ancient Greece built one of the most powerful institutions in the ancient world around a single magical ability, prophecy. The Oracle at Delphi was a Muggle-run operation where kings and generals paid to consult a woman who could see the future. Muggles built the temple and made the political decisions. The witch just sat on a tripod and delivered. That was the dynamic across all of ancient Greece. Muggles worshipped wizards and gave them the freedom to operate in the open with nobody to answer to. Herpo the Foul used that freedom to breed the first basilisk, a 60-foot serpent that killed anyone who looked at it, and to tear his own soul apart, creating the first Horcrux. A parcel mouth with the darkest ambitions in magical history, living in a world where Muggles had never told a wizard no. Voldemort followed the same playbook 2,000 years later, which says everything about how much dark magic has evolved since. It hasn't. When Muggles finally saw what their worship had made possible, the temples came down, and the pyres went up. Merlin's era. In the 5th century, a Muggle king did something no Muggle leader has done since. He invited a wizard into his court and let him operate in the open. King Arthur brought Merlin into Camelot as advisor, protector, and the most overqualified problem solver any kingdom has ever employed. Magic performed openly inside a Muggle government, with full permission. If anyone tried that today, the Wizengamot would hold an emergency session before lunch. The arrangement held because Arthur trusted Merlin, and Merlin believed wizards owed the non-magical world their protection. Then Muggle politics did what Muggle politics does. Camelot fell apart from the inside, and the last working model of wizard-Muggle cooperation went down with it. Nobody on the wizard side got a vote in any of it. Within centuries, the wizarding world gave up on the idea entirely. The Order of Merlin remains the highest honor a wizard can receive, commemorating a partnership that Muggles built and Muggles destroyed. The founding of Hogwarts. By the 10th century, Muggle hostility toward magic had reached the point where magical children were being hunted across Europe. Families moved constantly and still lost their kids to mobs who couldn't tell the difference between a 10-year-old with accidental magic and a dark wizard. 4 of the most powerful wizards in history decided that was enough. Godric Gryffindor, Helga Hufflepuff, Rowena Ravenclaw, and Salazar Slytherin got together around 990 AD and built a school. They hid it from every Muggle on the continent. Hogwarts was an evacuation plan disguised as a castle. The founders enchanted the building so thoroughly that Muggles who wandered near it saw nothing but dangerous ruins and felt a sudden urge to be somewhere else. 1,000 years later, the enchantments still hold. Hogwarts exists because Muggles made it dangerous to be a magical child. Every student who boards the Hogwarts Express is living proof that the danger never fully went away. The Black Death. The bubonic plague killed roughly 1/3 of Europe's population in the 14th century, and it did not check for magical ability before doing so. Wizards died alongside Muggles, and the chaos that followed created conditions the wizarding world was entirely unprepared for. It was the first time the magical community had to deal with a crisis on a continental scale. and the response was almost universally to do nothing. The most documented consequence involves Nicholas Malfoy, an ancestor of the Malfoy family, believed to have murdered Muggle tenants on his land and disguised their deaths as plague casualties. The Wizards' Council never censured him, a detail that says everything about the impunity the chaos made possible. He was probably not the only wizard to take advantage of the situation. He was just the one whose name made it into the records. Potions masters had remedies that could have helped Muggle communities, but were legally barred from sharing them. Wizards watched neighbors die from illnesses they could have treated. Concealment won out over intervention every single time, and the principle that Muggles came second was already wizarding practice long before anyone wrote it down. The European witch hunts. Muggles spent 4 centuries trying to burn every witch in Europe. They mostly burned each other. Between the 14th and 18th centuries, witch hunts swept the continent on an industrial scale. Muggles printed hunting manuals and built legal systems designed to execute anyone suspected of magic. Professional witch finders made careers out of it. Most of the people they killed had nothing to do with magic at all, which somehow made the whole thing worse. Real wizards mostly slipped away. Lisette de Lapin was convicted of witchcraft in Paris in 1422 and vanished from her cell the night before execution. Shortly after, a large white rabbit was spotted sailing across the English Channel in a cauldron, and that same rabbit allegedly ended up as an advisor to King Henry VI. Sounds ridiculous? Sure, but this is a franchise where a rat faked his own death and fooled the entire Ministry of Magic for 12 years. So, the bar for ridiculous is already underground. The witch hunts made one thing clear to every wizard in Europe: Muggles were never going to stop looking, and hiding had become the only way to survive. The Great Fire of London. On September 2nd, 1666, a fire broke out in a bakery on Pudding Lane. Yes, real street name. Ron would be happy. Within 4 days, it consumed 13,000 houses, 87 churches, and most of London. Yet the official death toll was 6 people for a fire that leveled an entire city. Either a miracle or deeply suspicious. Muggle historians have spent centuries explaining that away. The wizarding explanation is simpler. Someone helped. Large-scale evacuation magic, performed quietly and without credit, would account for the impossible survival rate. It would also explain why the Ministry has never commented on the fire, which is exactly the kind of silence that says more than a statement would. The timing is hard to ignore. The fire hit 26 years before the Statute of Secrecy, while the wizarding community was already debating full concealment. A magical disaster visible to an entire city would have been the kind of event that tips a debate from theoretical to urgent. The Scourers and early American colonialism. When European colonists arrived in North America, they brought their witch hunting traditions with them. But with no organized magical law enforcement on the continent, the wizarding community had no protection against what followed. These Scourers were wizarding mercenaries who emerged to fill that vacuum in the worst possible way. Operating under cover of the chaos and violence that defined colonial America, they trafficked genuine witches and wizards to Muggle authorities for money. The colonial project, built on the erasure of existing communities, created exactly the lawless environment the Scourers needed to operate freely. When Makusa eventually dismantled the Scourer networks, the survivors disappeared into nomad society and spent generations passing anti-magic beliefs to their descendants, framing their hatred of the wizarding world as a moral position rather than a grudge. The Barebone family, whose movement shaped some of the most significant events in the Fantastic Beasts era, descended directly from Scourers whose grievances were born in colonial violence. The era permanently damaged the relationship between the American wizarding community and the nomad population around it. The Scourers did not just hurt individual witches and wizards, they contaminated the entire relationship between the two communities for centuries. The Salem Witch Trials and the Statute of Secrecy. By 1692, the wizarding world had spent 2 centuries watching Muggles execute anyone who sneezed suspiciously near a candle, and Salem was the moment someone finally said, enough. Colonial America imported the European witch hunting playbook and cranked up the enthusiasm. Less preparation, more hysteria, and most of the people they actually executed were Muggles, which says everything about the quality control of the operation. The Scourers made it worse, wizarding mercenaries who sold real witches and wizards to Muggle authorities for cash, because apparently every crisis needs a profiteer. The International Confederation of Wizards took one look at Salem, one look at the Scourers, and signed the International Statute of Wizarding Secrecy, a document requiring every wizard government on the planet to go into hiding permanently. The British Ministry of Magic was created to enforce it. Makusa was rebuilt around the same mandate. Hidden streets, concealed platforms, invisible schools. Every piece of wizarding infrastructure that exists today was built because Muggles spent centuries proving what happened to magical people who forgot to disappear. The statute is the single most important document in wizarding history, and it was essentially a restraining order filed by the victims. The Muggle Prime Minister Brief. When the Statute of Secrecy went into effect, the Muggle government had one condition. Someone was going to keep them informed. Muggles agreed to pretend magic wasn't real, but they're control freaks at heart, and letting an invisible society operate on their land without oversight was never going to fly. Since the early 18th century, every new Muggle Prime Minister has received a classified briefing from the Minister for Magic, delivered through an enchanted portrait in the PM's office. A painting with opinions, a security clearance, and absolutely no respect for personal boundaries. The arrangement stuck because Muggle decisions constantly affect wizarding communities hiding within their borders. Demolish the wrong neighborhood, flood the wrong valley, and suddenly a wizarding village has a problem the PM never knew existed. Several prime ministers have found the whole situation deeply distressing, which is understandable. The alternative is publicly announcing that magic is real, and a painting has been eavesdropping on cabinet meetings for 3 centuries. The Muggle Awakening. So wizards went into hiding, but Muggles carried magic into their DNA. After centuries of living alongside magical people, those traces didn't disappear with a statute. Muggles started becoming more magical, and from a Muggle perspective, that was a problem. The people operating at a higher level noticed and responded by inventing concepts designed to get Muggles closer to magic, but never close enough to fully live it. Chakras, meditation, frameworks that Muggles created to explain abilities they were never supposed to have, while making sure nobody got too close to the real thing. Some gurus understood the laws of magic better than anyone expected. Yogananda Paramahansa became known for supernatural abilities any wizard would recognize immediately. The CIA ran the Gateway experiment to understand the magical powers of Muggles. Clairvoyance kept showing up in people who had no idea why. The wizarding world stayed quiet through all of it. The last thing the ministry needed was Muggles figuring out what was running through their veins. The Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution fronted the wizarding world with something it had not anticipated. Muggles were becoming powerful in ways that had nothing to do with magic. Steam engines, railways, and factories gave non-magical people the ability to reshape the physical world at a scale that rivaled magical capability. And the response was to look away and pretend it was not happening. The deliberate rejection of Muggle technology during this period, quills over typewriters, owls over telegraph lines, candles over gas lamps, was partly cultural pride and partly a refusal to acknowledge that Muggles had built something worth engaging with. This rejection created a technological divergence that widened with every decade, leaving the wizarding world increasingly isolated inside a self-imposed medieval existence, while the world around it transformed beyond recognition. By the 20th century, wizards were living in conditions centuries behind their Muggle neighbors. The ministry had decided that Muggle progress was not its concern, and spent the next 2 centuries discovering the cost of that decision in increasingly awkward ways. Arthur Weasley's wonder at rubber ducks and electric plugs in the 1990s is the entirely predictable result of a choice made over 200 years earlier to stop paying attention: the invention of the Muggle Railway. For centuries, getting hundreds of magical children to Hogwarts safely was a logistical headache involving port keys that made students sick and broom travel that risked Muggle sightings every single September. Then Britain built a railway network, and Minister for Magic Odeline Gamble saw an opportunity nobody else had considered. In 1830, intrigued by what Muggle engineers had created at Crewe, Gamble decided the safest way to move students was inside a Muggle invention rather than around it. The ministry carried out a large-scale operation involving 167 memory charms, and the largest mass concealment charm ever performed in Britain, to acquire a single steam locomotive. Railway workers and crew reportedly spent the rest of the year with the nagging feeling that they had misplaced something important, and could never quite explain what. The Hogwarts Express exists because Muggles built something so useful that the wizarding world simply could not resist taking it. Pureblood families grumbled about a school train with Muggle origins, but the Ministry had made its decision, and nobody else got a vote. Almost 2 centuries later, no one talks about where the train came from. The Muggle Gold Rush. Ever wondered why wizarding currency is made of actual gold? Galleons are solid gold coins, produced in goblin-controlled mines operating beneath the earth for centuries before any Muggle picked up a shovel. Goblins were extracting, refining, and hoarding gold before humans figured out what it was worth, and they intended to keep every ounce. The gold rushes of the 18th and 19th centuries sent thousands of Muggles tunneling into mountains where goblin mining networks already ran underground. Muggle shafts kept breaking into goblin tunnels, triggering containment emergencies the Ministry could barely manage. Goblins treated the intrusions as acts of war. The Ministry filed them as logistical nightmares. Muggles blamed cave collapses and kept digging. Gringotts sits beneath central London, with vaults stretching for miles. The wizarding economy runs entirely on a metal Muggles will start wars to possess. Every gold rush in history was, from the goblin perspective, a mass home invasion by millions of people with shovels. And if you ever wondered why the goblins at Gringotts look at you like that, now you know. The invention of photography. For centuries, the Statute of Secrecy ran on one comfortable assumption. Muggle witnesses could be obliviated, discredited, or ignored. Someone who claimed to have seen a broomstick over London could be memory charmed, called drunk, or politely disbelieved. The system worked because human memory is unreliable and credibility is easy to undermine. A camera has neither weakness. A photograph holds exactly what it captured, indefinitely, and can be copied and examined by people who were nowhere near the original event. For the first time, a Muggle could produce physical, reproducible proof of magic, and the Ministry had no protocol for it. The wizarding response was predictably bizarre. Adopt the technology immediately, figure out how to make images move using a developing potion, and then spend the next century trying to stop Muggles from using that same invention to photograph them. The Daily Prophet runs moving pictures on every page while the Ministry panics about Muggle cameras pointing at the sky. So, wizards love photography. They just wish they had invented it first and kept it to themselves. The sinking of the Titanic. On April 15, 1912, the Titanic hit an iceberg and sank in under 3 hours. Over 1,500 people died in the North Atlantic. Statistically, given the passenger count, at least a few of them carried wands. A single wizard with basic training could have done extraordinary things at night. A bubblehead charm lets someone breathe underwater indefinitely. Warming charms could have held off hypothermia for hours. Apparition could move people off the ship entirely. A competent witch or wizard had the tools to save dozens of lives before the first lifeboat launched. The Statute of Secrecy said no. Performing visible magic in front of 2,000 Muggle witnesses during the most publicized maritime disaster in history would have been the largest breach of secrecy since 1692. Any wizard on board faced a choice the statute was never designed to answer: save strangers and expose the wizarding world, or follow the law and tread water while people drowned around you. The lifeboats launched half empty. Some wizards may have quietly made sure they were on one. World War I. When World War I broke out in 1914, the British wizarding community faced the most uncomfortable question the statute had ever produced. Muggles were dying by the millions in a war magical people could affect, and the Ministry's official answer was to do nothing. Minister for Magic Archer Evermond passed emergency legislation forbidding wizards from participating in the conflict. The reasoning was largely defensible. Involvement risked exposure, and exposure risked the statute. Morally, it was harder to defend, and many wizards defied the legislation quietly, helping Muggle neighbors in ways the Ministry preferred not to acknowledge. The war reshaped the wizarding world less through direct involvement and more through what it did to the society wizards were hiding inside. A generation of traumatized survivors, a collapsed European political order, and a continent desperate to be told it would not happen again gave Grindelwald the audience he needed in the 1920s. Jacob Kowalski served in France and came home carrying what that experience does to a person. His reaction to Grindelwald's vision and crimes of Grindelwald is one of the most quietly devastating moments in Fantastic Beasts, and belongs entirely to what a Muggle war did to a Muggle man: the Spanish flu pandemic. Between 1918 and 1920, the Spanish flu killed somewhere between 50 and 100 million people worldwide, more than World War I managed in 4 years of industrialized warfare. It swept through every continent, and Muggle medicine had essentially nothing to offer. Wizarding medicine had Pupper-Up Potion. A single cauldron of it cures flu symptoms in hours. St. Mungo's healers had been treating magical influenza for centuries, with remedies Muggle doctors would have committed crimes to access. The knowledge existed. The ingredients were common enough to brew at scale. The statute made all of it irrelevant. Distributing magical remedies to Muggle populations would mean exposing an entire parallel medical system, and the Ministry had already set the precedent during the Black Death 6 centuries earlier. Muggle suffering was tragic, but not the wizarding world's legal problem. 50 million people died of a disease wizards could cure with a bad-tasting potion and an afternoon. The Barebone exposure of Makusa, 1920. Bartholomew Barebone, a nomad descended from Scourers, spent years befriending a young witch named Dorcas Twelvetrees. He gained her trust, convinced her to show him her wand, stole it, and published the locations of Ilvermorny and Makusa headquarters in a nomad newspaper. No dark magic required, just patience, charm, and access to a printing press. Dorcas Twelvetrees took the full blame. Career destroyed, reputation permanently gone, while Makusa quietly avoided the far more awkward question of why national security had depended entirely on one witch's taste in friends. Makusa's response was Rappaport's Law, a total ban on meaningful contact between magical people and no-mages. The law was so sweeping it turned Queenie and Jacob's relationship in 1926 into a criminal offense, and it stayed on the books until 1965. 4 decades of enforced separation because one man stole one wand and knew where to find a newspaper office. World War II and the atomic bomb. In 1927, Grindelwald showed his followers a prophetic vision: ruined cities, people herded toward trains, and a mushroom cloud rising over everything. The atomic bomb was 18 years from existing, and he was already using it as a recruitment pitch. Muggles were building weapons that could flatten cities in seconds, and any wizard content to sit back and watch was, in Grindelwald's framing, simply volunteering to go next. Queenie Goldstein watched that vision and decided he had a point. One of the most uncomfortable character turns in the series, and the scary part is the logic holds up. A weapon that hadn't been invented yet pushed a genuinely good person toward a dark wizard. The parallel between Grindelwald's movement and Hitler's was architectural. Same blueprint: designate an inferior group, repackage persecution as justice, convince followers that someone else's suffering buys their safety. Voldemort later ran the identical playbook with the Muggle-born Registration Commission: summons, wand confiscation, imprisonment, all justified by the fiction that Muggleborns had stolen their magic. NASA, Area 51, and the moon landing. When Neil Armstrong stepped onto the moon in 1969, the Muggle world celebrated one of its greatest achievements. The wizarding world's official reaction has never been put on record, which is suspicious given that astronomy is a core Hogwarts subject studied seriously. The idea that a community with centuries of detailed celestial knowledge had no internal conversation about humans leaving Earth strains credibility, and the silence feels less like absence and more like deliberate omission. Area 51 raises a different question. Makusa's mandate includes containing magical exposure across North America, and the confirmed presence of magical creatures throughout the continent creates an obvious overlap with the phenomena Muggle governments were reportedly investigating at classified facilities. Whether Makusa had any formal awareness has never been addressed in canon, but the geographic and operational overlap is difficult to dismiss. The broader problem the moon landing created is practical and largely unaddressed. Muggle surveillance satellites can photograph the Earth's surface in extraordinary detail. A community trying to remain invisible on a planet being mapped from orbit faces a challenge the statute's architects in 1692 could not have anticipated, and the wizarding world has never publicly acknowledged a plan for it. Cell phones, AI, and the surveillance era. The modern surveillance era is arguably the greatest sustained threat to the Statute of Secrecy since the witch hunts that created it. CCTV covers most major British cities, and almost every person carries a high-definition camera at all times. For a community trying to stay invisible inside a Muggle world, the infrastructure has never been more hostile. The specific threat AI poses goes beyond cameras. A machine learning system trained on enough visual data would eventually identify statistical anomalies that correlate with magical activity. Not because it understands magic, but because magic produces patterns. And patterns are what these systems are built to find at scale. The statute was designed for a world where humans had to notice things and convince other humans. It was not designed for a world where machines process billions of data points and flag anomalies. And after everything Muggles put wizards through, the real question is, why the wizarding world never took over the Muggle world? That's your next lesson here at Stickman Hogwarts. Watch now before a goblin files a copyright claim.